Welcome to the second part of plotting and pantsing with Jungian Psychology. In the last video we talked about how the psychological group of the convincers goes about outlining and discovering their stories when they go about writing fiction novels. Today we're going to tackle the other group, which I call the supporters. If you want to know more about convincers and supporters, I recommend watching the respective videos about them on my channel. Today's agenda will be a deep dive into the writing processes of supporter writers. We will talk about the differences between the two quadras within the supporters, the Navigators and Explorers, and I will introduce two important principles that you need to know as a supporter if you want to have more control over the outcome of your writing. First of all, two small recaps of things that we need to know for this video. For those who are new to writing and who have no idea what outlining and discovery writing is, I recommend you watch the video of last week where I give a brilliant explanation, or rather Brandon Sanderson lends me his brilliant explanation. In short, discovery writing means you launch into the writing without much preparation and you make it all up as you go, while outlining is a system for fiction writers to pre-solve a lot of problems. In my research of analyzing fiction writers and interviewing fiction writers, I found that there is not a single brain type that I can say is definitely a plotter or a pantser. Your brain type does play a role, but so does the intention behind why you write, as well as your neuroplastic development. However, once we learn about the difference in brain types, we will see which types tend to be more discovery writers and which tend to be more architects, and why. The second recap we need to have is about Jungian psychology. In order to understand how the supporters differ from the convincers, we need to look at the cognitive function of extraverted thinking again. TE is responsible for gathering data, comparing data, and structuring data. And the convincers can therefore compartmentalize their texts in their minds and rearrange them and restructure them in order to find a more ideal version. This happens quickly and relatively autonomous in the convincer's brain, and it defines their writing mode, which is a little like building bricks and then fitting them into an imagined structure. Supporters, however, don't express extraverted thinking very strongly. Their extraverted thinking is in their shadow, and they therefore lack this ability largely or entirely, which defines the supporter mode. They have to find their structure in a different way. And this is the perfect segue to actually get into the episode. How do supporters find structure for their scenes and for their entire novels? Well, they essentially have two different ways. Number one, experimentation. AKA, you just launch into the scene and you discover the structure as you go. Let's just assume you write without having prepared a scene structure. What'll happen is that you have to rely on logically progressing the scene. You ask yourself what's the organic or the logical thing to happen next. And just so you're not confused, convincers also do that. Everyone wants their scenes to progress organically, but convincers have the ability to imagine different structures in their minds, which also lead to an organic progression. And the supporters don't. Supporters have no choice but to just write ahead and hope the structure works.
She wakes up and she's like, what is this? What is this? I want all the information. Give it to me now. And it became this like 7,000 word info dump. Then my editor was like, what happened? I'm like, she woke up and this is what happened.
Writing itself is often like an experiment for supporters. And we will learn in the future that experimentation is very much a TI thing, because TI users always look for ways to dismiss data, and experimentation is part of that. You test something, it turns out it doesn't work, so now you can dismiss it. You test an opinion, it turns out it's wrong, you can dismiss it. And in the same way, they test out structures for their scenes. Of all the possible structures your scene could have, you can find the right one by just trying to write it. And if the first attempt didn't work, then it at least helped you narrow it down. And then if you rewrite it, you already know what went wrong the last time, so chances are that you'll get it right the second time or the third time. The second thing you can do in order to find your structure is externalize the structuring process. And here we have Rebecca Yarros again describing exactly what this looks like.
So when I plot, I'm a weird plotter. I sit down and I think about where the book is going and the scenes that come to my head about how to prove these points and get these people there. And I put everything out on index cards and I put it on my desk and then I move them into order.
What convincers do in their minds all the time, supporters have to do on paper. Externalize the structuring process. Write it all down on index cards and move it around, or write all the pieces and information on a paper and then play connect the dots. You can do this for a single scene or for the entire novel. To summarize, for supporter writers, the same conditions apply on a local level as well as on a global level when they're trying to find the structure of a scene or of a story. For comparison, the convincers often don't need to externalize that process on a local scale because they do it in their minds. Especially the strategist writers do all of this stuff in their minds. They structure the entire scene or the entire, not just the paragraph, but literally the entire chapter in their minds, and they think about it for a very long time, and then everything is ready, and then they just write it, and they never actually write an outline down. And then they look like a discovery writer, but in reality they're actually very much a plotter, in my opinion. If you think about it, because of this mental structuring capability, the convincers should be more discovery writers than the supporters. But in reality, convincers are often more architects because of their introverted feeling, which makes them so very invested in the idea of writing an amazing story. They're invested in the idea of that amazing achievement, and therefore they oftentimes resort to plotting their stories in order to try and ensure their own success. So now let's have a look at the two quadras inside the supporter category, the explorers and the navigators. And I want to start off with the navigators. Navigators express the cognitive function of introverted intuition. Introverted intuition is wantiness or desire. And it hooks onto a specific element of your story and fixates that, simply because you now want to have that element. And that's the very reason you even write the story. In theory, if your introverted intuition desires various elements of a narrative structure, you could arrange them in your mind, but only in a linear order. Because as a navigator, you lack extraverted thinking. This I want to do first, this I want to do next, this I want to be the last scene, this I want to be the big twist. Whatever your introverted intuition has decided that it wants to have in the story, it is now a fixed part of your scene or your story, and you now write toward it. And the structure going towards that piece is discovered or determined in a typical supporter writing mode through experimentation, through the act of writing. Navigators therefore often discover large chunks of the story around the few elements that they want to have. Some navigators have a clear idea of how the last book in their series ends before they even begin writing the first one. An example of this is, of course, Susan Cooper or J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling wrote the last scene of the last book before she started writing her second Harry Potter book. So now let's talk about the explorers. And here you need to know that explorers express the cognitive function of introverted sensing, which is all about paying attention to your own internal experience and trying to have a certain sense of enjoyment. When explorers aim for a certain target scene, for instance, then they usually aim more for a specific sense of enjoyment and not a specific scene. However, since they do not have that introverted feeling investment function, the end result can vary strongly for explorers. For instance, if they try to discover better and better experiences, they're not very invested in a specific sense of enjoyment, but rather they're very open to discovering new senses of enjoyment. If they find something better, then that's usually what they will take.
By the time you get to the middle, when you've actually been writing it, it's a different story now. It's a different thing now. You are the characters. You know the characters. Things that you could never have known before you started writing are now, they're in your blood. And I might have a checklist of things that I might want to do during the course of the time, but some of them become irrelevant. You want to be this expert. You want to be in the middle of the story. You want to know who these people are. And now, with all this knowledge, now you figure out where you want to go for the second half.
However, explorers, if they are trying to write a complicated story and they already know what the character arc is going to be like, then maybe there are some scenes in their story, in their outline, which have to be fixed. Explorers are typically very systematic, which means they're always trying to figure out what is the best approach to solve a problem. And they might find that the best way to write a complicated story is to just dogmatically stick to an outline. In these cases, they try to simplify things by just sticking to their outlines, and all these new ideas that they might have, they're just not going to pursue them. Again, because they do not have introverted feeling investment, they don't get invested in new ideas. So that is again an advantage here. Whereas the cartographers and the strategist writers, especially the strategist writers, oftentimes suffer from the fact that they get invested in their new ideas and then they want to change their outline and they want to combine all sorts of different ideas within their story, which is going to lead to the conflicting values problem. We're going to talk about that at some point in the future. But supporters usually don't have that problem because they don't get so emotionally attached to their new ideas or their old ideas. Generally, with explorers, they lack the introverted intuition desire as well as the introverted feeling investment. The stories of explorers tend to change the most while they're writing them because they aim for a sense of enjoyment and they don't mind if it isn't what they aimed for when they started writing. Before we close out, I wanted to add another principle that supporters should always remember. You really need to make sure that you have all the information that's relevant for the scene when you start writing it. Because if you're missing information, then it just won't become part of the chunk of text that is being created by your supporter writing mode, which again is relatively structureless. You will give yourself a very hard time because you will have to either rewrite the entire thing or you will have to try and insert that information somehow without feeling like you are completely disrupting the structure of the text.
It's like writing a story. Change one tiny detail and everything changes from that point on.
The convincers have an easier time with that because they know that if they have to insert something in a scene that they've already written, they only disrupt certain elements of the story going forward. And they can identify these elements with their extroverted thinking and they compartmentalize it all and they find the text that they need to modify, and chances are high that everything is all right. Although here I have to mention that some convincers, especially the strategist writers, also hate rewriting and restructuring, but that's mostly because of their desire to have a good presentation and a good flow to their text and to the scene, and restructuring disrupts that flow. All right, that's it. This was the deep dive into plotting and pantsing for introverted thinking users. I hope that this was helpful. I hope this was insightful, that you got some clarity perhaps. There's going to be 3 more videos about supporters and convincers, and I hope I'll see you next time.